everybody. Part of me thinks I'm crazy presenting the content today. I'd much rather be talking about 3 tiny habits. But I'm going to present stuff that actually nobody's ever heard all of this before, not even my lab members. I usually like trying out stuff on my lab members, and I shared some of it in my master class. But we're going to dive in, and we'll see what you think. Let me first start with a little bit of a preamble, a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, and it's the phrase, motivate behavior change. My hope is we'll take that out of our vocabulary, and we'll instead replace it with facilitate behavior change. Now, Dustin, who's speaking later today, in his summary, he says facilitate behavior change. Great. That's the direction we need to go in, because that, you'll see at the end of this talk where I'm going, motivation matters, but our role as UX designers for health is not so much about motivating, but facilitating that change. Let me talk about motivation and motivation waves. In our lives, I think most of us would agree that motivation goes up and down. It's a fairly slippery construct. A little bit of a clarification there. These are not actual motivation waves. Okay, this is a conceptual diagram of it. But I think we've all experienced in our own lives where we have peaks of motivation, and what happens during those times is this. We are temporarily able to do hard things. That's what makes them special. Now, we don't always stay at that peak. We have troughs, and the motivation goes down, and at that point, these are natural periods where we cannot do hard things. We can still do simple things, but we can't do hard things. In a lot of, I think, the past designs that people have created for health, there's an assumption that the motivation's always up or we can always boost it up. I'm not a fan, actually, of amping motivation. I'm a fan of leveraging or surfing the natural motivation waves that happen because of events in our lives, what happens in the media, and so on. I believe our typical state is kind of down here in the troughs, especially when it comes to health behavior. There may be other types of behaviors that we have high motivation about and we get amped up. But when it comes to health, most people, and those of us in this room are not like most people, they're not super excited about doing health behaviors that are not urgent. So again, when it comes to non-urgent health behaviors, motivation tends to be lower. So here's the picture, conceptual. Again, this is not scientific data. Temporary moments of being able to do hard things. So let me fast forward to what I think is the health solution in one sentence, and it's this. Help people succeed on the most desirable behavior that matches their current motivation. That was the simplest way I could explain it. Maybe in the future I'll come up with a better phrase. Maybe in the future I'll think I'm wrong. I'm always in learning mode, but right now this feels right to me and it seems right. There are a few things to unpack here. One is that first phrase in the yellow that you may or may not be able to read, help people succeed. There's a lot in that, and I'll come back to that. Next, most desirable health behavior. I'll come back to that. And current motivation. And I'm going to start there. I actually like the word current motivation. It's the motivation that somebody has in that moment and that instance, and it can be up and down, and it can be high one moment, and a few minutes later it can drop down. So I like the word current because I think it applies flow. And I also think there's motivation around different things. If we just look at, let's just take appetite. There might be motivation to get a drink, and there might be motivation to eat, and there might be motivation for salty foods. I'm not going to get into that granularity today. I'm mostly going to talk about high motivation and low motivation as we look at it against what kinds of behaviors are possible. So you may look at this and say, we're doing this in our product or our company, and that's great, and I think a lot of you are. What I'm not presenting today is a new service or product that solves everybody's health behavior problems. What I am presenting today is a way of thinking about an algorithm, an approach to changing health behavior long term. And I think if you're not doing something like I will describe in the next few minutes, I would be worried. If you are, and probably many of you are, I'm hoping it helps you recognize what you are doing that's helping people change their behavior. So let's talk about desirable health behaviors. That's one part of that phrase that I want to unpack just a little bit. And so I'm going to treat it as a unit, and here's how I think about it. They're beneficial habits, positive changes in our environment. In fact, as I see it, that's the only way to change behavior long-term quickly, is to change the world around us, the built world, the social world, and so on. Structured behaviors, these are behaviors that are like defaults or preset. You have appointments, you have commitments, you cut up your credit card so you can no longer use the credit card. It's a way of changing behavior where we're not necessarily making decisions. Behaviors that are fitting to the moment. At 3 a.m., some health behaviors are less appropriate than others. Taking your vitamins might be a good thing to do in the afternoon at 3 p.m., but at 3 a.m. it might be exactly the wrong thing to do, and different for different people. I was talking to a guy in Boulder last week, actually a few days ago, and he came to me and said, BJ, how do I stop working out so much? I just work out all the time. And I said, well, first of all, don't tell anybody that's your problem. They're going to hate you. But next, and he's a triathlete, and he just is constantly working out. And desirable health behaviors are next steps in a process and so on. This is about all I'm going to try to unpack this phrase. I'm not necessarily the expert on the most desirable health behaviors. Some of you are, and scientists out there. Let's dive in and look at, I'm going to, again, treat this conceptually. So imagine there are 10 desirable health behaviors that are related, and they range from easy to hard. On the easy side of things, so let's take physical activity. On the easiest side of things, it might be getting somebody to pick out a pair of exercise shoes that they like. Not buy them, not wear them, not use them, but just say, if you were picking out some exercise shoes, what would you pick? On the hard side of things, it might be training for 2 hours every day during the winter. So I'm going to build this up using my behavior model. If you haven't seen it, check out the site. It's a little bit dated. I'm underperforming on this site, I will admit. I think there's a card coming around that summarizes some of it. Some of you already know this. In my behavior model, I talk about ability and motivation, and it essentially says that if somebody has high motivation and high ability, when they're triggered to do a behavior, they'll do it. And then the opposite's true. If they're not motivated, they don't have ability, then they're not going to do it, no matter how many times you trigger. And there's a relationship between the more motivation you have, the harder the behavior you can do. And that's what I'm going to talk about right now. So let's take those 10 physical activity behaviors. When somebody's motivation is really low, and see on the far right those 2 blue dots, they'll be able to pick out their shoes and do something else that's very simple. As the motivation goes up, people can do harder behaviors. So as the motivation, I call this motivation wave, I don't know another word for it, as the motivation wave goes up, people can do harder and harder behaviors, and as it goes down, they can no longer do those hard behaviors. Now this, I do think the motivation construct is very slippery. It's hard to manipulate in people, and when you do manipulate it overtly, they feel a little uncomfortable, but it does go up and down all the time. Notice when it's up here, we can do hard behaviors, but as soon as it starts slipping, the ability to do those slips from us. So that's what I'm talking about when I say there's an opportunity to do hard things when we're highly motivated, but this is very temporary. So as a designer, when you look at this and you say, okay, so you know somebody's motivation is high, well, what do you have them do? Do you have them pick out which shoes they want to buy for working out, or do you have them schedule and sign up and commit to meeting a trainer every day for the next month, the harder types of behaviors? In contrast, when their motivation is low, what do you have them do? Do you try to get them to contact the trainer and sign up and pay the money? Not going to work. What I'm proposing here is you can always get somebody to do something if it's easy enough. So even if the motivation is low, whether it's low or high, if you don't know if it's low or high, if it's easy enough to do the behavior, you can get people to do it. And that's part of what I have been exploring for a couple of years. That's what Tiny Habits is all about, and so on. So looking at the opportunity for designing for health user experiences, if we can understand that somebody's motivation level is high, and that's one of the unresolved issues. I'm not going to tell you how to solve that, and I hope some people will map that out for us. We have this temporary opportunity to do some very specific things. I've prioritized these things. I'm going to give you priority 1, 2, and 3. I don't know if these will be my priorities a month from now or a year from now, but here's how I think about it. First of all, if your motivation is super high, or if your user's motivation is super high, or somebody you're trying to influence, priority number one, have them do a hard thing that structures future behavior. An example of this might be, say you're super motivated to exercise and get fit. Yeah, don't just pick out the running shoes, get in touch with a trainer, pay for that trainer, and schedule them to come to your home every day for a certain period of time. It's a hard thing, but it structures what will be coming next, and it gets you started on exercising. You actually have to work to avoid that behavior, and I think that's what characterizes structuring a behavior. To get out of the behavior, you have to input work to do it. It happens by default. In other words, you're setting up a default or something that will happen automatically. Priority number two, do something hard that makes future behaviors easier or reduces the barriers. In this case, an example might be when you get home from the grocery store with your vegetables, you wash them, you cut them up, you put them in serving-size containers, you put them in the fridge right there where you can see them. That's kind of a lot of work, but your motivation's super high, so you're doing it. Then later, throughout the week, as the motivation sags and so on, your goal of eating more vegetables becomes much easier to do. In some ways, I'm a bigger fan of number two than number one. I think number one could feel manipulative if people aren't doing it for themselves. If somebody's imposing it on you, like I'm taking your credit cards and cutting them up, oh, you need more physical activity? I am selling your car, so you have to ride your bike to work, things like that, yeah. So I got to be a little careful there. But I think it is more powerful than number two. That's why I prioritized it. And then next, priority three, do hard things that increase people's skills, their capabilities. For example, if you want to eat healthier meals that you fix at home, if there's a recipe you can learn, that's kind of hard, but then the next time you do it, it'll get easier and easier and easier. So that's an example. You're not necessarily structuring the behavior. You're not reducing the barriers necessarily as much as training yourself, training your user, the person you're helping, to get more capable to do that hard thing. So what you don't do at these moments, you'd still get some traction, but I think you're missing an opportunity. You don't have people do simple one-time behaviors. You don't have people do tiny habits. You don't have people do simple, easy steps. I hope it's pretty clear why you don't do that. Those are things you can do pretty much any time. And this motivation wave is fleeting, and so if we're going to make progress and if we're going to accumulate the tiny habits, the structured behaviors, the sequences of baby steps. And in some ways, I think the long-term picture is how do you take those moments of motivation and transition people so future behaviors are much, much easier. And I'll show you diagrammatically what I mean by that. So here you have high motivation. Let's take the issue of increasing capability. So you're going to transition that down. So in the future, it is much easier to cook that recipe again. Let's take the next one, reduce barriers. You're going to take those vegetables, cut them up, put them in the fridge, make them very visible so the next time when your motivation sags, it's really easy to eat the vegetables. Let's take the one of structuring behavior. You call the trainer, you schedule, they show up. You actually have to input work, so it's very easy at least to get started on training with the behavior. So it's these three approaches that I want to call harnessing the wave, harnessing the motivation wave before it subsides, and adding more and more down to this space where there are desirable behaviors that are easy to do, that don't require lots of motivation. So it's kind of like harvesting or harnessing or skimming off that energy and changing it into something else that's desirable. The three categories, and there's probably more, of these easy things: one, structured behaviors, defaults, things that are already prearranged; tiny habits, little simple things that you do on a regular basis that require virtually no effort or time; and baby steps, teeny tiny things that you do. So that's how I would look at that. So then when your motivation goes down, you can still do the structured behaviors, the tiny habits, the baby steps. Now again, I realize, and I hope that some of you in your products and your services you're creating, this is ringing a bell. It's like, we do that. And that's great, because I think this is the approach, the algorithm, the method, the way of thinking about helping people change their health behavior. It's in contrast in some ways to the idea that we're going to help people create new habits and do hard things, and we have to keep amping and boosting their motivation. We have to sustain motivation for a long period of time in order for them to change. I think that's unrealistic. I think it has failed over and over, and I think we should stop designing systems that do that. Mostly leverage motivation ways that happen naturally. There's probably times when you boost motivation some, but to rely on your own creation to keep boosting motivation in a user, I think is a failing path. Okay, let's talk about helping people succeed down here. I've hit on these points. So when people don't have tons of motivation, and again, I think with health behavior, this is where people mostly are. One, they can do the structured behaviors they have. Two, tiny habits are very simple little things. Baby steps, take steps in a process, and so on. So with that, health solutions, seriously? Maybe you agree, maybe you don't. Today, I think this is, I think it's right. Maybe a year from now, I'll come back and say I've revised it or it's wrong. Again, I'm always in learning mode on this. But I think we're at a point with health behavior in our culture that we need to take some risks. I need to take some risks and get it out there, see what people think. Let me step back and review. So the phrase, and I think it's 14 words, is help people succeed with the most desirable health behaviors that matches their current motivation. Understand that motivation is often low. When it's high, you can do these three hard things: structure future behavior, reduce barriers, increase people's capacity. What I didn't put in the top three was do a one-time thing that's hard. Go get a body fat measurement, go get some other kind of one-time behavior. That's 4 or 5 or 6. I don't think it's as important as 1, 2, and 3, unless it's leading to something else that's vital in the process. When it's low, you can still trigger. Now, trigger is the call to action to do the structured behaviors, the tiny habits, the baby steps. Because they're easy, the motivation doesn't have to be very high. And overall, the image I kind of want you to keep in your mind is this idea of harnessing the wave, of taking, during those moments of high motivation, harnessing, turning it into something else. Structured behavior, tiny habits, and baby steps. Now for health designers, when I shared this with my lab members, part of it, they said, VJ, be sure to lay out the implications for designers. So this isn't a complete list, but let me share some of them. Number one, harness whatever motivation exists at the moment. In contrast, and this is my point of view, you may disagree with it, don't rely on artificially amping up motivation. I think there's enough motivation that happens naturally in our lives. If you can understand when that's happening, and that's one of the unresolved issues, there are ways to do it, but I don't think anybody's fully mapped that out. Leverage what's already happening. Number two, guide people in creating these structured behaviors. I think if you go to everyday, ordinary people, they have no idea what the structured behaviors are even possible for them. And I think that's part of the role as a health experience designer, is to lay those out and help people achieve them. Focus on baby steps for long-term change. There's only 2 realistic ways to get long-term change. One is to change somebody's environment, like I said, their context, their social world, and so on, and you can change it fast and dramatically. If you can change their context fast and dramatically, that's really pretty rare. It means moving, it means living in a different spot, it means changing the workplace. It can happen in some limited ways, but I think the more realistic approach is baby steps, little by little change people. And as they do those little simple things, they naturally change the world around them, or they naturally find a way to change, to find a world that's different than the one that has trapped them into the old behaviors. Trust that tiny habits grow naturally. So I haven't talked a lot about tiny habits, but one of the things I'm fascinated with is if you start doing something very small, and it is truly a habit, you do it every day automatically, that little habit will grow and grow to its natural size. So if it's exercise, I think in our culture the natural size is like 30 minutes, it will expand that. If it's floss one tooth, and I know some of you are flossing one tooth, we've talked about this. Yes, there we go. Now you're flossing all your teeth, yes, a little bit later. Yeah, so try that as an experiment. If you're not flossing, just get one tooth down and see how that naturally expands. And there's something really magic about little successes. I don't have a word for it yet. Maybe somebody does here, but I've seen, so now about 3,000 people have been through 3 Tiny Habits. And over I see that when people succeed on these little small, ridiculously tiny things, their feeling of success is disproportionately large. And they write me and say, VJ, I have no idea why I feel so awesome about myself. All I did was hang up my keys on the hook when I walked in the door, but I feel awesome. If you know a word for that, let me know. And then it seems to free them up or give them, maybe it's more motivation, I'm not quite sure, to do harder things in their life. 2/3 of the people that do 3 Tiny Habits report they also made other positive changes in their life in a week besides those 3 Tiny Habits. So there's something really interesting about these success after sex, even if they're super tiny, and I'm really fascinated with that. And finally, be wary about this phrase. So let me turn it back. It's motivate behavior change. I think we're sending the wrong message, and when we say that, and I hear it a lot, I'm getting, I don't want to get cranky about it, but if it's in private, I will stop and say, do you really mean that? Are you designing a system to motivate behavior change or facilitate? And I think when you facilitate, you harness the motivation and you make it easier to do future behaviors that are desirable. And I think that's the difference. Even if we were to systematically change that phrase and talk about facilitating behavior change, our designs would be different, our assumptions would be different, the people we work with, and so on. So that's it. Health solution. I hope you're seeing some of this play out in your products and services. I hope this has brought you something new to think about. I welcome feedback. I do think it's an important time, like Todd was saying, in the history of our country to bend the trend, to change how people are behaving. It's a really, really hard challenge. I'm so happy that there are events like this and people like you that are creating services. The thing, I guess maybe I'll leave you with one last thought. When we create products or services for behavior change and people fail, when they can't do the exercise we outlined, they can't change how they're eating, if they can't follow the program for reducing stress, if they feel like they've failed, we have done them a big disservice. It's not neutral. We've made them less capable of succeeding in the future. In some ways, you might look at the overall kind of tide of motivation, and it drops a little bit, and it drops a little bit more. And I think in a lot of places, people have failed and failed and failed and failed. Eventually, that's called learned helplessness. And I am optimistic that this group and what we're doing at events like this, it's changing how we're designing things. So we're designing for success, so people have these successes and can take on harder and harder things. Thanks very much. Right on time.